Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the 5-Minute Bible Study series on To Be Like Christ. There's a free PDF that has all this information on it that you can download on our website. If you haven't been out to the website, there's a bunch of new stuff that's been added, so jump over there. There's a link in the description. You're going to see the PDF up on the screen. So let's talk about 1 Samuel 9. We're going to talk about Israel getting a king for the next couple chapters, where we're going to be introduced to the guy who's going to be the king here in this chapter. His name is Saul. So anyway, let's talk first about our timeline. When did these events happen in history? Well, Samuel, who is God's prophet and judge, he was probably born around 1100 BC, and Israel got its first king somewhere around 1050 BC. And as we look at our list of characters, as I mentioned, Samuel's pretty much our main character. The book's named after him. He is, he grew up in the tabernacle under the care of Eli, who was the last judge of Israel. He was a prophet of God, and he delivered God's messages to the people. We're going to be introduced to a guy named Saul in this chapter. Saul was the man who God selected to be the first king of Israel. He was from the tribe of Benjamin. The locations of this chapter are a little bit harder to pinpoint because they're a little bit more obscure, but we're going to be spending most of our time around the territory that was given to the tribe of Benjamin. In 1 Samuel 9, Saul traveled through the hill country of Ephraim, the land of Benjamin, and the land of Shalisha. Now, the exact location of the land of Shalisha is not known. There's also a reference to the land of Zuph in verse 5, and that's probably in the northern territory of Benjamin. We're also told about a meeting between Saul and Samuel. It took place in a city, but we're not given the exact name of that city. All right, so now for our outline, let's talk about the first 10 verses first. Saul and the lost donkeys. Kish, Kish. Kish was a rich man who was from the tribe of Benjamin, and he had a son named Saul. Saul is described in a very interesting way. He was taller than everybody else, and the Bible also says that he was more handsome than everybody else. We'll talk about that in our application section. One day, the donkeys of Kish went missing, so Kish sent his son Saul and a servant to find them. They went all over the place. They went through the hill country of Ephraim, they went through this land of Shalisha, and then they went through the area of Benjamin, but they couldn't find the donkeys anywhere. When they were about to quit, the servant reminded Saul that there was a man of God, a seer, a prophet nearby. And so they decided that they were going to visit this man of God, who turned out to be Samuel, and they were going to ask him for help locating their animals. Now this takes us to our second section, verses 11 through 27. Saul meets Samuel. Saul and the servant met Samuel in the nearby city as Samuel was going up to the high place to bless a sacrifice that the people were going to be offering that day. Now, God had spoken to Samuel the day before this, and he had kind of forewarned him. He had told him ahead of time that today was going to be the day that he met the guy who he was supposed to anoint king over Israel. And so Samuel was already mentally prepared to meet Saul on this day. Before telling Saul all of God's intentions for him as king of Israel, Samuel invited Saul to eat and then to spend the night with him. And he assured him that there was no reason to continue worrying himself about the donkeys because the donkeys that he was searching for had already been found. Samuel then blessed Saul's house, and he foretold that they were going to be the recipients of a really great honor. Saul was somewhat incredulous about this. He was shocked by it because he didn't come from any kind of great pedigree or background. In fact, he said, quote, "Am I not a Benjaminite from the least of the tribes of Israel? And is not my clan the humblest of all the clans of the tribe?" Samuel doesn't give him a direct answer here. He will further clarify this in chapter 10, but he invited Saul to come and to eat with them. He sat Saul down at a place of honor in the hall. There were like 30 guests there gathered. He sat Saul down in a great seat. He gave him a good piece of meat that he had set aside for him previous. And after the meal, Saul spent the night in the city. Now, the next morning, Samuel told Saul's servant to go ahead and to return home ahead of Saul because Samuel wanted to have the opportunity to speak to Saul in private and to tell him the words of the Lord and the intention that God had for him going forward. So that is chapter 9. It kind of leaves us hanging. Saul doesn't have the whole picture here, but as chapter 10 opens, we'll get the rest of the story. And now for our application. Looks can be deceiving. Saul looked the part of the king. We mentioned that he was taller than everybody else. He was more handsome than everybody else. And he was probably the kind of man that other men want to follow, the kind of man that people would want representing them. Unfortunately, I'll say this, spoiler alert as to the story of Saul here. So if you don't want to know the rest of the story of Saul and you just want to kind of go through the text and figure it out as we go, you can turn the video off now. I'll give you a few seconds. Okay. If you don't care about spoilers or you already know the story, here's what we know from the rest of the story of Saul. Saul looked like a king. Yes, he had the appearance, but his reign as king was kind of disappointing. He really wasn't the king that Israel needed to steer them in the right direction, and his heart changed later in his reign to turn against God. Now, in contrast to that, Jesus didn't particularly look the part of a king. In fact, there's some prophecies about Jesus in Isaiah chapter 53, verse 2, that says Jesus wasn't going to be a man of particular majesty or good looks from a human perspective. But Jesus turned out to be the king that everybody needed. So be careful before you judge a situation or an individual based on outward or initial appearance. Later on, when God was selecting the second king of Israel, he says this to Samuel, quote, "For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart." 1 Samuel 16, verse 7.